first, thank you for the invitation to participate in this webinar. I will try to complement from the OEM point of view what Ryan and Chan have been talking about models. I will try to, as much as possible, to remove the Vestas cap when we are talking about the models. But we will try at the end to emphasize on how we are adopting the digital twin concept in Vestas in our model development. So first, to place ourselves in the different available models we have in the market and from different OEMs, we could group them into four main ones, right? The first of them will be the EMT models. We have talked a lot about EMT models, but we have to make sure that it's not only the control part and the source code integration or the digital twin that takes part in regards to the control, but also the way to model the hardware. And this is something important that we need to keep in mind. When we talk about EMT models, different OEMs might choose one or another approach that implement average or detailed representation of the inverters, and that will make a huge difference depending on the type of phenomena you are analyzing. Then under the second main group, we have the RMS models. We still need some positive sequence models, and some of these are modeled depending on the approach by the OEM by integrating the source code, although some others might do another different approach. The third big group of models we have in the market available from OEMs are the open source models. And these models are basically developed by OEMs to meet some market requirements around the globe, where the TSO enforces some transparency in regards to models. We will look further what is really driving TSOs when they require models, but some of them they require to understand what are the control blocks diagrams behind the models. And then finally, what Ryan was mentioning in his presentation, we have the standard models that are used by some TSOs and ISOs. There are the two main standards by WEC and IEC, which are positive sequence RMS models that have a generic representation to try to accommodate every OEM into one single dynamic model. But as we could expect, that is not really possible to do in an accurate way. So there are certain functionalities that are missing and cannot accommodate all OEMs. So regardless in the way how we produce the models, let's please have a look at what are we doing when we use the models. We talk about EMT and RMS quite frequently, and one thing is the environment where we have the model. If we are using an EMT time domain model, or if we're using an RMS phaser or phaser model. But it is important also to understand that we don't need always an EMT model if depending on the type of study that we are carrying out. I try to draft here in this slide for reference some of the most common studies that we use when we are doing a grid interconnection study of a new power plant. We don't have time to go one by one through them, but we can understand, or it's easy to understand, that when we are running the PQ capabilities or a long-term planning of a wind farm or any inverter-based technology, you don't need a super accurate detailed EMT model source code integrated, because probably you will reach the same results with a more generic model. But in the current challenges of today's grid, when we are seeing a lot of new wind sites connected into very weak grids, when we have mechanical oscillations, control interactions, we have SSR issues, then we need to move towards the left in this slide, and then we have to look for an EMT model. But as we see in the next slides, EMT is not the only answer for that, because it also depends in the way in how you produce that EMT model. From our experience, when we have been doing grid interconnection of hybrid power plants, we have seen that other OEMs, they do not always produce the EMT models in the same way. So even though they might be in an EMT tool, they are not accurately representing the real product they sell. So that's important. It's not only it's a time domain or a frequency domain, is also the way the models is produced. So just to give you an overview of why different OEMs decide to take one approach or another, I have tried to group here the 4 driving factors for TSOs or ISOs around the world that we have seen from Vestas. First of all, or the first of them is the simplicity. I will try not to mention any specific ISOs or TSOs that doesn't have a representation here. But we have seen some countries when their main concern is about the simplicity of the deliverables of the model. They might not have a high penetration. In some cases they do, but they want an available model that is built into the library, regardless of the accuracy of that model. And that's definitely against the digital twin concept, because as Ryan mentioned in his presentation, it's very impossible. And if I recall correctly, he mentioned 90% of the solar solar produced power plants, they say that the dynamic models is obsolete or quite inaccurate. So then the second group will be more in regards to the IT security, and this is a very few group of 1 or 2 TSOs. Then, regardless of the accuracy of the model, they don't allow to have any external files. So depending on the software tool that you are developing the model, then you have to code it inside that software tool. Again, this goes against the digital twin concept, because we cannot expect OEMs to replicate the entire code control into other tools in different coding languages. And then we have where most of the most mature TSOs are. There are group 3 and 4. The group 3, I mean, it's not that one TSO has to fall into one particular group, but these are mainly their driving factors, is the transparency. And here I can mention one specific TSO that has a representation in the webinar, that is AMO. AMO is very much concerned not only about the accuracy, but also about transparency. So as a mandate, we have, or any OEM in Australia have to deliver an open source model. Open source model for private companies, for any OEMs, is a challenge when we'll look at in the next slide, is a challenge if we want to maintain high accuracy, because we have basically to expose the internal controls of the power plants, of the wind turbines. And then the latest group is the fidelity of accuracy. When the TSO have realized that in the current challenges of the grid, what is most important is to have an accurate model that really represents the product, either in RMS or EMT, but an accurate model. And this also AMO will fall in, and that's why I say it's one of the most mature TSOs, because they are also request a PSCAD model, for example, in that case, or in future shifting to HyperSim. When in an EMT environment, we can deliver a model that, regardless their encryption, it represents accurately the product and the wind power plant that you are interconnecting into the grid, because otherwise it will be impossible to rely in any grid interconnection studies that you carry out. Then the way the OEMs develop the user region models, I'm not going to spend too much time in here because I only have 15 minutes, but basically I just want to highlight the dilemma behind this, because when we are developing a user region model, most of the time is to comply with the open source philosophy, and then we have to expose any OEM have to expose their design, and then require some simplifications from the real code of the product into the model that might compromise the accuracy and fidelity of the model. So there is a dilemma here. As much as if you put more details in the open source model, you have a smooth grid code compliance or grid interconnection studies, but you increase the IPR exposure from the company. And then the subject that is relevant here today is the source code integrated models. And this is from, if I put the Vestas cap now, this is how we have adopted this digital twin concept internally in the model development. In all of our tools, we take the real code of the product, either turbine or power plant controllers, and we integrate it through external DLL files into the simulation platform. But as I think Jen mentioned that sometimes this interface in OEMs are different and parameterization might be different, so it's very difficult to make a correlation. Internally in Vestas, we have adopted something we call internally UMF, that is a unified model framework, that one single DLL will be reusable regardless of the simulation tool. So when we deliver out there one simulation model, regardless if it's PSCAD or Power Factory or whatever, they will call always the same DLL and the same control code. Understandable, depending if the tool that we are calling is an RMS or EMT tool, some of the controls will be simplified when we have that differentiation, but it's always calling the source code of the real product. In order to do this, and this will be the position I would say of most of the OEMs, we need to protect somehow. In order to increase the accuracy and fidelity of the model, we need to protect somehow the intellectual property, and that's why we compile this into encrypted DLLs or lib files when we ship out the models. Important that these models are able to reproduce the real product performance under any circumstances. This is the only way we have to cope with the current challenge of the high penetration of inverter-based technologies. When we are dealing with weak grid projects, unbalanced faults, and serious compensation, and we need to determine how to tune the protections of a wind farm, the only way to achieve that, it will be with a source code integrated model that accurately represent the controls of the real plant. Then the story doesn't end there, because it's not only the control, it's also what is communicating from the control into the hardware of the model. If you give a look of what an EMT black box model will look like, and this will say is the case of probably all OEMs, the control code is one piece when we do our source code integration, and we have the real product control. But another thing is that you need to make sure your electrical circuit, your hardware in this case, is accurately represented as well. So that means that you have to represent your inverters, your IGBTs, your filters, and everything accurately in the model to make sure the final performance of the model resembles the real product. And then we go to the third leg of this, that is the parameterization. We have received feedback from different TSOs that parameterization is quite chaotic. Some studies are done using a set of parameters, and those parameters never end up in the real plant, or there is no link between the parameterizations of models and the real product. So in this case, the parameterization we have is directly taken one-to-one from the real product and can be extracted either from the design phase or from the construction side. So that means that the model, the approach we have in here, it calls an external parameter file that can be extracted from a running power plant and can be just simply dumped into the folder where the model is placed, and then you should get the same parameterization of the plant that is operating out there. So it's very important that it's not only to achieve the digital twin concept, to have the control, also the hardware part. So internally, in Vestas, how we work here for the model development, we have what we call the UMF code in the center of this presentation, and we have separate wrappers to interact with different commercial tools, software tools that are shown in here. And depending if we are talking about EMT or RMS, we might have some simplifications in the control loops, because some of the fastest control loop cannot be, when you have an RMS model, you normally run with higher time steps, so you cannot accommodate some of the higher frequency control loops. So those are simplified, and then they are produced massively with the same DLL. So in Vestas, when we ship a model, regardless if it goes to US or Australia, it will always go with the exact same DLL. So then finally here, I just have 1 minute left. I'll give you this as a support material, but this will be an overview of what we understand from different type of available models are classified in terms of accessibility, accuracy, functionalities, and so on. I will give you this for later. And then I would like to give you some overview of what we do when we reach to that level of validation. We can see that normally every time we run a model, since it's the same DLL, we are automatically producing all the supporting documentation to validate that these models are accurate and are agree between tools. So we can see when the phenomena you are studying falls into a category that you can have accurately an RMS or an EMT tool running, you can see the good agreement of them. But finally, also something we do in here to achieve that our models are accurately representing the product model, the site measurement campaign test and all that. When there are big contingencies in the grid, like the one that happened a couple of years ago in Argentina, we extract the instantaneous data and we fetch that data into our model to make sure that the models also behave in the same way they did in the field when they are under real conditions. When you do a site test or a measurement campaign, many factors uncontrolled, and you don't have a full freedom to operate the turbine. But in this case, you might have a contingency that varies both frequency and voltage, for example. So we reproduce that and we check our models to make sure that they are one-to-one. And it is the case because it's basically following the concept of a digital twin. I think I'm over time. I just want to close with this phrase that I found that is important to keep in mind, that all models are wrong, and the practical question is, how wrong do they have to be not to be useful? And if we translate that into our world of the power system and grid interconnection analysis, will be that how accurate a model must be to perform grid interconnection studies, considering the future challenge in a power system with high penetration of inverted base generation sources. And the answer to that, when the computational power is not an issue, is very straightforward. It has to be a digital twin. Otherwise, we won't be able to have accurate results from a grid interconnection studies that we can rely on. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much, Miguel. So now we'll move to Tim.